We will move on to another Nick Silver, who is the founder and director of the Climate Bonds Initiative. You are working, the Climate Bonds Initiative is working with governments and to develop policies that will facilitate institutional investment at scale in the low carbon economy. And Nick is coordinating the local authority energy efficiency partnership, which is working with municipalities to bring in large scale investments into domestic energy efficiency. And Nick is also part of the UK government's Capital Markets Climate Initiative, which aims to drive large-scale investment into climate change mitigation and adaptation. So please, Nick Silver.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me here to speak, and thank you to the Global Challenges Foundation for this organising this imaginative and timely event. Anyway, I attend a lot of events on climate change, and you normally get to hear about really interesting stuff like extreme weather, ice caps melting, or the latest high-tech clean energy developments. But I'm going to talk to you about insurance company regulation. Right. But why I'm going to do that is if we think about risk the way insurance companies do, I feel this gives us a framework for setting greenhouse gas targets. Now, of course, for me, that's a necessity, but it's not sufficient. And the work that Nick has, and Paul have so eloquently outlined about how we move the financial markets to get there, and the other work I'm doing with Climate Bonds Initiative, I think that's vitally important. But I'm going to just focus on this very narrow question and see where it gets us. First of all, a quick overview what an actuary is. We are long-term risk management who apply mathematical techniques mainly in finance. But I just wanted to say that the financial crisis taught us that mathematical models are not sufficient to properly manage risk and can be a source of risk unto themselves. It's often the case that the risks that you should be most worried about are the very ones that are outside your model. And I think this very much applies to climate change as well. The very good talks this morning talked about scientists being conservative. Now, what scientists mean by conservative is what it says in their model, right? Well, if you think about who's conservative, is it conservative to wear a seatbelt in your car because there's not much chance of your car crashing? No, it's not. It's actually, the conservative approach is to worry about the most risky things which you don't know about, right? That's basic, our approach. Right, the main part of my talk, I'm going to talk about approach to risk management, which I think is particularly applicable to climate change. We call it the risk of ruin approach. This comes from a legislative requirement under Solvency II, which is the regulation governing how insurance companies operate. So it's what insurance companies have to do by law. And the way, like to give you an overview, what it says is think of something that's really, really bad that you don't want to happen. Work out the probability that you can live with of that really, really bad thinking happening. And then applying that to climate change, which greenhouse gas concentrations should you set to avoid the really, really bad thing happening, right? Insurance companies have been around for a long time and are often critical to the functioning of markets. But they have a number of intrinsic problems, one of which is called asymmetric information. So if you buy an insurance company, you don't know if your insurer is going to be around to pay the contract because they've got a lot of stuff in your books, on their books, and you don't know how risky that is. And over the years, lots of companies have failed. So practice and regulation has developed over a long time to try and protect policyholders and build confidence in the system. And it accumulated in the current requirement, which is that insurers have to hold enough capital so that they will survive a 1 in 200-year event, right? And that rule has worked very well recently. Most companies survive the financial crisis and really bad things happen, like the Japanese tsunami, and they didn't fail, right? But if you think about that, a 1 in 200-year event, that's a long, long time, and pretty much anything can happen in that period. For example, 200 years ago this year, Mount Tambora erupted, causing widespread crop failure and mass starvation. This was the famous year without summer where Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein. That was a long, long time ago, but yet insurance companies now have to set aside enough money so that they can survive such events, Right, this slide here shows a simplified version of how this works. What you do is that green curve shows you work out the probability of all the things that can happen with less probability than a 1 in 200 year event, and you have to hold up enough cash, right, to cover those losses. And this is a summary of the issues. One thing I'd like to mention is adverse incentives. Again, this is particularly pertinent. The company would like to write as much business as it possible because that means it will get the best return on its capital and make the biggest profits. But that's actually diametrically opposed to what's good for a policyholder because it increased the risk of the company failing. So there's an important balancing act there, which insurance company has to do. And the way it balances out is that their accounts have to be signed off by an independent professional actuary who has a duty to act in the public or policyholders' interests. And that's a counterweight against the insurance company just wanting to make as much money as possible. So what's that got to do with climate change, right? Well, the regulatory regime has been developed to protect policyholders, to ensure financial stability and keep risk within acceptable boundaries. Under climate change, people face uncertain but possibly catastrophic risks, which they cannot manage themselves, and these too need to be kept within acceptable boundaries. Things like asymmetric information, systemic risk and adverse incentives apply as well. For example, we want to burn as much fossil fuel as possible so that the people who burn it make money out of it, but also so our economies can keep growing. That's the one side, the boosts the profits in insurance companies, but the other side, that increases the level of risks, just like insurers who want to make bigger profits. But protecting ourselves from climate change is, I would argue, a bit more important than protecting policyholders from their failure of their insurance companies. So you could use the same model for dealing with this, right? In insurance company capital modelling, the ruin scenario is quite obvious: does the company go bankrupt? Whereas in climate change, the definition of ruin scenario has to be much more subjective. And when we've done that, we can then work backwards to work out how much CO2 in the atmosphere it represents an acceptable risk. Right. So first of all, we have to work out what a ruin scenario, what a scenario we want to avoid at all costs is, and we talked a lot about that this morning. So I'm just going to whiz through quickly. If you look at the last right-hand bar on that says that at those temperatures you get risk of large-scale discontinuities. Now that sounds very much to me like what I call a ruin scenario for the planet. For example, breakup of ice sheet, changes in ocean current, or changes in the pattern of monsoon rains. These could possibly impact millions of people, right? So we definitely want to avoid those. The next chart shows, which you saw this morning, shows some possible extreme events, many of which represent probably unacceptable risk. And of course, Bill Hare talked this morning about what would happen with a 4-degree C world. Right, so if we took a ruin scenario as we want to avoid 4 degrees C temperature increases, I'm not wedded to that, but that's somewhat arbitrarily. So what would that mean? So I just want to outline my methodology. We see in the next slide. If you look at the yellow bars, go back a bit. Right. So the key concept here, again, we touched on this morning, is climate sensitivity. Climate sensitivity is what happens to the temperature, the average temperature, if you doubled CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. And according to the previous IPCC report, there's a 2/3 probability that temperatures increase between 2 and 4.5 degrees centigrade, and that's illustrated by the next chart. So the yellow bars shows what happens with increased concentration levels of CO2, what temperature rises. But I want to point out that the yellow bars represent a 68% confidence interval. So that means that there's 32% chance that we're outside that. So if we sort of split it 50-50, there's a 16% chance that we're above that confidence interval. And if you're thinking about insurance companies, they work on 1 in 200. So that's 0.5%. So the probability of being above that yellow bar is 16% compared to what financial sector thinks is an acceptable risk, which is 0.5%. Right. So and this next chart shows the difference. So, the parameters we're working with in the IPCC report are the green bars, but what we actually should be working with are more like the blue bars, because the things that are going to happen are really so bad that we should be trying to limit their probability of happening to very low probabilities. Right. If in my next slide I show, you can then work back to think about what sort of CO2 atmospheric concentrations represent a reasonable acceptable risk, and you get 415 parts per million, which is approximately about what is in the atmosphere today, right? Then I've got a little more to say about the climate sensitivity in the IPCC report actually doesn't represent the real climate sensitivity, because then you have to take into account, it should be taking into account long-term feedback mechanisms like the albedo effect. But I've got to whiz on to the last slide, which are my conclusions, right? My rather startling conclusions, and this is from a risk management approach, is that the carbon dioxide already released into the atmosphere probably carries an unacceptably high risk of severe climate change, and that for me, an actuary, a risk manager thinks that the rapid decarbonisation of the economy is the correct risk management approach. And this is not an alarmist conclusion. In fact, it's quite the opposite. Actuaries and insurers are seen as the most prudent. Even we're always accused of being boring, right? No one says you're an alarmist if you buy insurance because your house might burn down, right? But using a risk management approach, this is the conclusion you reach of what we have to do. Now, taking a risk management approach to the political process, that's obviously not working. It's working far too slowly. It's not going to give us the results we want. And finally, we're already beyond what is a safe limit, and we actually, in the future, will need to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, which we don't yet know how to do. Right. And finally, my recommendations. Although I've said that the current process, international processes, aren't working, we do need global governance and a regulatory regime which works for us. The one that we have obviously isn't, so we need to think about designing a new one. And there are models here. For example, there's, as I've just explained, the regulatory environment for insurance company gives a pretty good model. The way central banks work, where governments outsource the decision for something they consider very important to a third party who's outside the political process. And we should also be talking about anthropologists, because they've studied how people get together and make decisions, right? They kind of know the answers to these things. We've got our political process is too slow. The only chance we have is if we have one cause for hope is the rapid improvement in efficiency of some renewable technologies, which makes them more economically viable than fossil fuels. For example, solar has already achieved grid parity in many countries, but there are large sectors of emissions where this hasn't happened or is nowhere near happening, for example, like transport and agriculture. Then thirdly, as Nick intimated before, economics isn't enough. Just because something might be competitive, one technology might be competitive against fossil fuels, we're still stranded. We have an existing infrastructure which is locked into the fossil fuel economy, and we need to work out how we finance the transition from what we already have to a new renewable sector. And that's obviously going to cause a lot of damage and because they're stranded legacy assets. So what do we do about those assets? And finally, and probably most controversial of all, we actually need to suck out CO2 of the atmosphere. This isn't the same as carbon sequestration, where you burn coal and put it in the ground. It actually, you have to work out, we've got too much of it in the atmosphere already, or we're very likely to have in the near future from a risk perspective, and yet no technologies that are viable, or except for maybe trees, that know how to do this at scale, and we don't yet know how to finance that. So thank you very much for listening to me, and thank you very much again for inviting me here to speak.
stay for a minute and we will invite the audience to ask questions. And maybe if I can start by asking you the same question, do you feel in your particular sector and branch, do you also feel lonely at times?
No, actually there are a lot of people, well, yeah, we actuaries think in the same way, so there are quite a large group of us who've come to exactly the same conclusions. And we saw from the gentleman from Swiss Re that he's not alone in the insurance industry. There's a whole
pretty
insurance
lonely,
initiative.
I think.
Well, there's the mainstream often hasn't got. And then a lot of my work, I work in developing countries, and you can obviously see their problems, but you can see the solutions much more. For example, I work in Nigeria, say. You sit in an office in Nigeria and the lights go out every so often. And so I asked them, why don't you have solar panels? And they said, well, they're too expensive. And I told them the cost, and they said, well, actually, at that cost, we buy them just to avoid power intermittency. So in developing countries where they haven't yet got the infrastructure, it's much cheaper to build new infrastructure than to have to replace existing infrastructure with incumbents who you're going to make bankrupt effectively.
But it's very hopeful if you're saying that this is now mainstream, this way of thinking. That's good. Yeah. Other questions? Yes, the back in the green shirt. Try again.
I will try to speak loud.
Or you just take the seat in front of you and try the microphone there. It's easier.
I think it's working.
How is it now? Oh,
yes.
Yes. One of the recommendations is global governance. Would you mind to explain again what that would mean?
Okay. Well, currently, the negotiations have fallen under the auspices of the UN, under the UNFCCC, and I think we're at COP18. So if you did an analysis of the ambitions of each of the previous COPs and did a graph, you'd probably find that the ambitions, the distance between a global agreement has stayed the same or even gone down, over time. So this obviously the forum isn't working. So let's think about how we redefine the forum, which actors we can actually get to take action. And I've got allowed to say this here. I say about the UN that was set up to avoid people going to war. So the way it works is two countries going to fight. The UN says, well, just come and talk to us for a bit. So they go to the UN, they sit down, there are all these procedures they have to go through, and then it takes years to get through them. And then by the time they finish these procedures, they've forgotten why they want to fight, and then they can't be bothered and go home again. So the UN was designed to stop things happening, right? So it hasn't, I don't think it's set up to get things to happen and stuff. And a quite good example of getting things to happen is like central banks. I mentioned before, governments used to manipulate interest rates for their own political ends, right? So the current trend is for them, well, we want to actually take it out of the political process and give it to a bunch of experts who are under, that might be a model that you could look at.
Thank you. Other questions? If not, thank you so much, Nick Silver, and thank you all for your interventions here that have been very interesting and enlightening. I don't think that we have that much time left for other comments, but if you have questions or comments, please just raise your hands and we'll try to accommodate that. And then, yes. Tilman Brück from CIPRI.
Thank you. What I think is fascinating is that here in the former Chamber of Parliament, we're discussing the meaning of the word conservative. And it seems to have very different meanings to different people. And sitting here on the left-hand side of the Parliament, it seems that even your estimates aren't conservative at all, because you forgot that curve which points even higher. And I always thought conservative in the sort of probability sense meant, being very prudent and accounting for things which are not very likely. And, you know, I mean, maybe being very conservative about driving, you shouldn't drive at all, you know, rather than put on your seatbelt. So I'm wondering if what you're suggesting is actually not at all, you know, prudent. The prudent thing would be to have a much lower level still. I just wondered how you thought about that.
Yeah, I know, I entirely agree, but you then have to make some kind of value judgment, as you say, without any risk, you wouldn't do anything, right? But then you have to think about what people think is an acceptable risk, and what Dennis was talking about earlier about when would you get on an aeroplane, how many accidents, you know, that's quite a nice framework for thinking about it. So I just, you know, as an actuary, I use numbers, so I said, well, 5% is the kind of risk, but it's almost to be, that should be the focus of the argument of what really bad events are happening, and then what probability are people happy with. You can't ask people directly because people aren't very good at like giving you a number, but you can actually work out implicit what their probability that people will accept is.
This is, of course, a general question, but very pertinent to all of us and to this whole, crucial to this whole debate. We have another comment, please.
Hi, yes, I had a question to Paul and possibly Nick as well, maybe all of you. Efficiency. Now that's sort of, myself, I've always assumed that, you know, energy efficiency, that was gospel, what we're always aiming for in terms of business, industry, energy saving. But I've recently come to realise that there is a paradox and perhaps a perverse incentive that we really need to address in talking about efficiency, which is that business models are predicated on if you save money through efficiency, well, if you save money, let's say through efficiency, then you reinvest that money into further developments. So does efficiency really give us actually a reduction in use of resources, or does it actually lead to more resources? I had never even thought about this myself before until quite recently, because I've always assumed it was a pretty good thing for us to aim for. But I've been quite challenged in this, and I wonder what you think about that.
Let me just give one tiny example from video conferencing or video telephony or something. You know, I've often argued it's good to have more of that. And believe it or not, people from the telecommunications industry have said, oh, but when people communicate more, they then get to know each other better and go on more aeroplanes. And it's like, I think it's missing the point to that point. The point is, the plan is to maybe introduce tax on air fuel. That would be a good thing. So airplanes were more expensive, and then this energy efficiency is complementary. So I think if you just take it in isolation, it can have a perverse effect, but I think it's part of a program. But maybe Nick can give a nuanced response.
Yes, I think this is known as the rebound effect, and is an important issue to think about. Particularly in Europe at the moment, where we have very low levels of economic growth, energy efficiency is very, very important. It takes costs out of the economy, releases capital for other things. It also actually drives down energy bills, which then creates some headroom for us to invest in renewables and other low carbon options. Crucially, then, we need a high carbon tax, high carbon price, cap and trade, whatever, to ensure that when you get your savings from energy efficiency, it isn't then diverted in other high carbon options. So the three packages go together. Energy efficiency, you reduce the cost, it allows you more room for investing in low carbon supply, but you need that high carbon price to ensure that that doesn't go into other options and you have that rebound effect. So the three things absolutely essential together.
Oh, and just to ask, a follow-up, do you feel that argument is being pushed, you know, with the three elements together, or do you feel that there's a risk that they're being pushed in isolation?
Well, that's the big debate in Europe at the moment about developing our post-2020 targets. And yeah, I mean, I think at the moment the macroeconomic logic for economic energy efficiency is very, very strong at the moment. The technology is here in Europe. It's capital intensive. It's labour intensive. It helps on energy security and energy imports. But we need that carbon price as well to lock in those gains.
And the key issue is how many euros are being spent lobbying in favour of regulation, how many euros are being spent lobbying against, and whoever spends more typically wins?
The answer to the question is very complicated. Is this on? Yeah, the answer is it's complicated because if you think about lighting, if you change all these light bulbs to LED, they're so much more efficient than normal ones. You could only light your house or building so much, so you're going to get an efficiency gain. Similarly for things like heating, if you make your house or buildings much more heat effective, you don't really get a rebound effect because people don't want to have their house at 40 degrees, right? But as Paul mentioned about video conferencing and generally the internet, it's easier for people to book travel. You get to know people in foreign countries, so you want to see them more, and then that has to be combined with legislation. So in itself, it could create. So it depends on what you're trying to do in the technology. I don't think you can have you can't say energy efficiency or efficiency as a whole has no rebound effect or has rebound effect because it's very specific to exactly which bit of efficiency you're talking about.
Thank you all. Thanks to our speakers, and we will make a break for lunch, and we will I think need an hour for the lunch break, so please welcome back in an hour's time. Lunch is served outside here. Thank you so much, and another round of applause for our guests.